everyone. This is Aaron. You know, recently I had a discussion with a fellow church member of mine, and he was explaining to me about how another pastor wanted him to join his church, and he said when he got there, then he would appoint him to be his armor bearer. Well, of course, he said no, and he came and joined the church where I attended. And so I really haven't given much thought to the whole issue of the armor bearer, but apparently it seems that it's still a big debate going on in the church about this. I thought that the whole armor bearer issue and concept had gone the way of, say, the church building fund campaign. Well, apparently it's still big, and so I'm going to give my reasons against the office of the armor bearer, and it's all based on what is spoken in the scripture. So of course, I'm going to present my case against armor bearers and showing how there is no biblical support for the office or its functions. And certain passages of scripture that I'm going to look at where you see the word armor bearer specifically mentioned. You see it in Judges 9:54-57. You see it in 1 Samuel 14:7. You'll also see it in 1 Samuel 16:21, as well as 1 Samuel 31:4-6. So, reasons for the error of the office of the armor bearer are these. One, armor bearers serve kings. Not only do they serve kings, but they serve high-ranking members of the military as well as other members of the royal family. As well as this, unless it has been established in the scripture by God, we cannot take something specific or general and assign spiritual value when there was none. If God didn't ordain it to be so, then we should not make it so. All right, so first of all, we need to see this right here. There are no kings in God's church. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you back to 1 Samuel chapter 8. I'm going to look at a couple of things here, and you can see how God thinks and feels on this issue of kings in his body. So 1 Samuel chapter 8. I'm going to look at verses 4-9 first, and I'm not going to read all of 10-21, but I just really want you to see this. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4-9 say this. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice, however you shall solemnly forewarn them, and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them." So the people came, and what did they say? We want a king. And why did they want a king? Because we want to be like the other nations around us. But God said what? They haven't rejected you, but they rejected me. Because basically he's saying, I am their king, and it is I who give them their directive. But you had the people who are saying, no, we want to be like other people. And then when you get to verses 10-21, I'll just read a couple of them so you can see. Basically says this: "So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands." 13, "He will take your daughters." 14, "He will take the best of your fields." And so basically it says this, that the king is going to use the people for his own purpose. All right, so let's continue. Let's look at some scripture references now where we're talking about how the armor bearer was seen and used in the Old Testament. So first there is First there is Abimelech. And he can be found in Judges chapter 9, verses 54-57. So let me read those to you, and we can see. Now, of course, Judges is before Samuel, and you do have mention of an armor bearer in Judges, but this is Abimelech. Now, if you remember about Abimelech, there was Gideon, who was a judge. Remember the guy who had 300 men, and he defeated an army, and they didn't fight them. They just had the the light and the bowls, and they busted the bowls and shouted, and then the people fled. All right, that was Gideon. He had 70 sons, and then when Gideon died, one of his sons, Abimelech, killed all of his brothers except for one, and we'll see what happened there. So Judges 9:54-57, here is what they say. Then he called quickly to the young man his armor bearer and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, lest men say of me, a woman killed him. So his young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed every man to his place. Thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father by killing his 70 brothers, and all the evil of the men of Shechem God returned on their own heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. All right, so let's go back, however, to verse 4 through 6 in Judges chapter 9 to see what really happened and how Abimelech got to this point. Let's read verse 6 first. Verse 6 says this, and all the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Milo, and they went and made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. So after Abimelech killed his brothers, they made him king. Now let's go back to verse 4 because we want to see how all this came about. Verse 4 says this, so they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. You see that? So Abimelech's motives weren't true and righteous. He hired worthless and reckless men, and then all of a sudden they made him king. And of course, what did the king have? Verse 54, he had an armor bearer. But of course, we see that all of this was wickedness and it was sin before God. It really didn't work. So that was Abimelech. Now, let's look at Saul and David. 1 Samuel 16, 21, and it says basically this. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. You might say, okay, so is there anything really wrong with that? Go back to what God spoke through Samuel about what the king would do. He would use people for his own purpose. And so David was not used for God's purpose, but he was used for Saul's purpose, which was to play the harp for him to soothe his troubled spirit. All right, and as we move on, we can see other passages. There is Jonathan. And now with Jonathan, you know, we're going to see something else about the armor bearer. We're going to go to chapter 14. Now, it says verses 4 through 15, but I'm going to focus on verses 6 through 7, or 6 and 7. And this is the time when Jonathan said to his armor bearer, let's go and do some damage to the enemy camp. And they did. So let me read verses 6 and 7 in chapter 14. Here's what it says. Then Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. So his armor bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart. Go then, here I am with you according to your heart. And of course, they go into the enemy camp and they do some damage. They kill 20 men. You might think 20 men is not a lot. For 2 men to kill 20 and put fear in the heart of the enemy camp is a great deal. But what you have to see is this. His armor bearer could handle his own in battle. What happens a lot today is that pastors are getting men to be their armor bearer so that they can train them up. In other words, they're getting people who supposedly need to be taught how to handle their own. And of course, we see here that the armor bearer is someone who came in being able to hold his own. And of course, there is also looking at the death of Saul, and that is in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, and that's verses 4 through 6. And here's basically what it says. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men died together that same day. Look. Question is this: to what extent are you required or even willing to serve another person? Saul asked his armor bearer, look, kill me because I don't want them doing anything to my body, much like what David did to Goliath. So his armor bearer was like, no, I can't do that. Saul took his own life, and his armor bearer saw that, and he took his own life as well. Would you fall on your sword for the sake of someone else who had fallen on his own sword? So here's the thing. How do we reconcile what is required of the present day armor bearer with this New Testament passage? And it comes from Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. There it is right there. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. So if we are to work out our own salvation, how can we do that in the service of someone else as their armor bearer? This is just the Old Testament with the New Testament passage. I'm going to follow this up with New Testament evidence against the armor bearer. So, once again, as always, this is Aaron. Thank you for listening.